Atlantis. I mean, you hear that name and you instantly have a picture in your mind, right? Glistening underwater cities, maybe some super advanced tech, or even a certain superhero wielding a trident. But the real story of Atlantis? It's way stranger and, honestly, a lot more interesting than any movie. It didn't start as a lost continent to be discovered, but as a warning to be understood.
And this is the line that kicked the whole thing off. This one dramatic sentence comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. It's pretty much the birth certificate for the world's most famous lost continent, and wow, has it fueled imaginations for over 2,000 years.
So that's the big question here, isn't it? How on earth did Atlantis go from a philosopher's make-believe story to a place people are literally trying to find on Google Maps? It's a fascinating tale of how an idea can get twisted, misunderstood, and completely reborn in ways its creator never, ever intended. So let's peel back the layers.
First up, let's talk about the Atlantis that lives in all of our heads. You know the one. When you hear the name, you probably pictured this majestic, sunken kingdom, a world of gleaming spires, maybe some magical technology, and mythical beings. It's the Atlantis of Hollywood, of comic books and epic adventure stories.
Okay, so check this out. The gap between what we think Atlantis is and where it actually came from, it's huge. What we see as a magical paradise was originally meant as a cautionary tale. What we imagine as a home for superheroes was actually a story about the dangers of arrogance. To figure out how we got from point A to point B, we got to go right back to the beginning.
Let's get to the source itself, the philosopher Plato. Now, it is absolutely crucial to remember that Plato wasn't a historian, he wasn't an explorer, he was a thinker. And he used stories to make really powerful arguments about politics, about ethics, and about how to build a perfect society. And Atlantis, it was one of his best tools.
And this right here, this is the magic word, allegory. Plato's story of Atlantis was never, ever meant to be a historical record. It was a fable designed to teach a lesson. Believing Atlantis was a real place is kind of like thinking the tortoise and the hare actually had a foot race. You're missing the entire point.
So where does this story actually show up? Well, it's tucked away in two of Plato's famous works, these philosophical conversations he wrote called dialogues. In these, a character named Critias tells the story, claiming it's this ancient tale that's been passed down for generations.
But why? Why did Plato even make this up? Well, this slide breaks it down perfectly. Plato's teacher, the famous Socrates, had just finished describing his idea of a perfect society. So he says, okay, now I want to see this perfect state of mind tested in a great war. And his friend Critias pipes up and says, you know what? I've got the perfect story for that. And he launches into the tale of ancient Athens versus Atlantis.
And here's the twist, the part that gets lost in all the movies. Atlantis was the bad guy. It was this massive, rich, powerful empire that got totally corrupted by its own arrogance. In Plato's story, this empire tries to take over the world but gets stopped by a smaller, more virtuous Athens, which, surprise, surprise, just so happened to be the perfect model of Socrates' ideal state. The story was basically a mic drop for Plato's argument.
You know, for centuries after Plato, most scholars were on the same page. They knew Atlantis was a fable. But then, it's like a giant historical game of telephone began. The original message got passed down, twisted, and reinterpreted until it became something completely different.
This timeline really lays it all out. Just look at that enormous gap. We're talking almost 2,200 years between Plato and the guy who resurrected Atlantis, not as a fable, but as a so-called historical fact. For 2 millennia, it was mostly just a literary curiosity. Then, in the 19th century, one book changed everything.
And this is the guy who lit the fuse, Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, this American politician and amateur writer published a book that would single-handedly spark the modern obsession with a real, historical Atlantis. He completely changed the game.
Now, Donnelly's theory was wild. He basically said, forget Plato's moral lesson. He claimed Atlantis was not only real, but it was the mother of all great ancient civilizations. He argued that pyramids in Egypt and Mexico looked similar because, well, they must have both learned from the same master source, Atlantean survivors. He completely ignored Plato's original point and reinvented Atlantis as this lost, high-tech paradise. And let's be honest, Donnelly's version of Atlantis, this lost super civilization, is way more exciting than a dry philosophical lesson, right? It was a concept that was practically made for a new era of mysticism, pulp fiction, and, you guessed it, blockbuster movies.
Before it hit the big screen, the story took a detour into some pretty mystical territory. You had people like Madame Blavatsky and the psychic Edgar Cayce who just ran with it, adding all these new layers, like psychic powers, magic crystals, and ancient secrets hidden under the Sphinx. The story was getting bigger and a whole lot weirder.
And this is how it all gets cemented in our brains. Donnelly's idea gets supercharged with all this mystical stuff, and then, bam, it's everywhere. From Disney's animated classic to the sci-fi city ship in Stargate, the idea of a lost, advanced civilization became a classic trope. Plato's arrogant empire was long gone, replaced by a fantasy world of wonder and mystery.
So, what happens when a bunch of people start believing a mythical place is actually real? Well, the next logical step is you go looking for it, right? And this belief has inspired countless expeditions, wild theories, and, of course, plenty of TV documentaries.
One of the most popular theories today centers on this incredible formation in Mauritania, known as the Richat structure. And you can see why people get excited. The concentric circles kind of match Plato's description. But the scientific consensus is pretty clear. It's a natural geological formation that's about 100 million years old, it was never an island, and there is zero archaeological evidence of a city there. Basically, picture a huge geological dome that got its top sliced off by erosion over millions of years.
All right, theory number 2. This one tries to connect the myth to a real, catastrophic event, the massive volcanic eruption on the Greek island of Santorini around 1600 BC. This disaster really did wipe out the powerful Minoan civilization. So the idea is maybe this real-life disaster was the seed for Plato's story. The problems? Well, Plato said Atlantis was in the Atlantic, not the Mediterranean, and he said it happened at 9,000 years before his time. The details just don't line up.
So, if all the evidence points to Atlantis being a fable, why are we still so obsessed with it? Why can't we just let it go? The answer, it turns out, isn't buried at the bottom of the ocean. It's buried deep inside ourselves.
Because ultimately, the search for Atlantis was never really about finding some sunken ruins. It's become something much, much deeper. The whole idea of Atlantis has turned into a blank canvas, a place where we project our biggest hopes and our deepest fears as a civilization.
Think about it. The myth is just so versatile. For some people, it's a story of a perfect paradise that we've lost, a golden age we want to get back to. For others, it's still what Plato meant it to be, a powerful warning about power and arrogance. But it's also a story of hope, this idea that humanity was once and maybe could be again something truly great. It's a mirror that shows us what we want to be and what we're afraid of becoming.
And that really brings us full circle, doesn't it? Plato made up a story about a lost society to make us think about what a perfect society would be. And all these years later, we're still kind of doing the same thing. So it makes you wonder, in our endless search for a lost continent, what Atlantis are we really hoping to find today? What lost paradise, what forgotten wisdom are we truly looking for?